Welcome, friends. As I had promised earlier, here is the part 2 of the lecture Preserving Muscles and Bone in Patients with Semaglutide Therapy or GLP-1 receptor agonist therapy. Today's focus in this particular talk is on protein supplementation in patients who are already taking GLP-1 receptor agonists, a scenario that's becoming increasingly common in our practices and one where the clinical stakes are surprisingly high. Most prescribers think protein supplements are just nutritional adjuncts. Friends, they are not. Not particularly in this population, because we are dealing here with patients who already have altered gastric emptying, variable renal reserves, most of the times unknown kidney insufficiencies, fluctuating glycemic conditions, and often a complex polypharmacy burden. Every one of the 6 domains mentioned on this slide represent a genuine clinical trap. We must watch for all these traps. We must have approach towards protein supplementation with a very careful scrutiny of the labels of the product which we are going to prescribe, and most importantly we must have a structured plan for each patient separately, customized to his individual needs. The absolute first step before any protein supplement is prescribed is renal assessment. This is absolutely non-negotiable. EGFR, serum creatinine, albumin creatinine ratio, all three should be done at the baseline and should be repeated after 15 days and then after 6 weeks. Here is why it matters in this particular context. High protein intake above 1.3 grams per kilogram per day accelerates GFR decline in patients of early CKD and worsens definitely entire profile of the care in these patients. Therefore, whenever the patient is having GFR above 60 and there is no microalbuminuria, we can take liberties with the protein preparations. But definitely, as soon as the patient is classified as proteinuria or microalbuminuria or EGFR between 45 and 60, we should try to shift towards the plant proteins. And below 45 of EGFR, we should not think of aggressive protein supplementation unless it is very carefully supervised and really strongly indicated. No unsupervised supplementation should be given otherwise also in any patient who is having even a slightest grade of CKD or suspicion of CKD with diabetes and patient already taking semaglutide. The compounding risk with semaglutide is critical because nausea, vomiting causing dehydration will immediately trigger acute kidney insufficiency in our patient. And high protein load on the top of the dehydration with semaglutide with compromised kidney is a recipe for a disastrous acute event. Patients on dialysis are one exception where protein needs to be actually increased, but only under supervision with a nephrologist in close consultation. Now, this slide addresses, I think, a very common clinical trap which is usually overlooked. A patient is doing well on semaglutide or whatever diabetes therapy we are giving him with GLP-1 receptor agonist, and we find that everything was improving. Suddenly it plateaus out and starts regressing also. 90% of the times I have seen these patients have started some misadventure either with nutrition or with a supplement. And when you find a protein supplement being taken by them, as a cause of regression of the glycemic controls, you will find that they are having a hidden load of as many as 20 to 30 grams of carbohydrates in each serving. So, friends, you have to be very careful. Commercial protein shakes marketed as gym supplements or supplements for gym goers are not protein supplements purely, they are caloric supplements also. So these are the biggest disruptors of our controls. These flavored powders should be carefully looked onto their labels. Mass gainers and meal replacement shakes, which their children are taking, most of the times the patients start taking those same preparations. So standard nutritional formulas which are popular in at least in Delhi NCR where I am practicing, I have seen that many of them are containing as much as 30 to 50% of the carbohydrates with very high glycemic index. This is the biggest trap in clinical medicine. Prescribing rule is simple. Read the label and do not allow any protein preparation which is having more than 5 grams of carbohydrate per serving. I will prefer a protein serving which is having less than 3 grams or just 2 grams of carbohydrate in it per serving. I mean. Now the type of protein is not interchangeable, and this slide explains why. The key variable isn't just protein, its leucine content and essential amino acid content and its ability to cross the mTORC1 thresholds of activation. So leucine is the light switch for muscle protein synthesis, and you need at least 2.5 to 3 grams per serving to flip on this switch. Whey isolate is the first choice. It's a complete protein, high in leucine, has an insulinotropic effect that actually attenuates postprandial glucose spikes also. And importantly, the isolate form is lactose stripped, it is lactose free, which matters enormously for GI intolerant or GI intolerance created by semaglutide in our patients. Whey concentrate is not the same as whey isolate. It retains lactose, a significant portion of lactose and fat. For vegetarians, the soy is the best source. It is cardioprotective. It has proven to be cardioprotective and CKD friendly. The phytoestrogen content, which is frequently discussed, is clinically not that significant with the standard dietary doses we prescribed. So that conversation can be laid to rest. Pea protein is a reasonable alternative, especially for soy allergy patients. But then this is an incomplete protein. It must be complemented with rice protein or some other protein. So our ancestral wisdom in Indian cuisine, where teen dal, lentils or panch meal dal or things like these are recommended, they are very intelligently combined, and then adding rice protein to it further complements and completes the list of essential amino acids required for muscle synthesis. So a careful planning with your dietitian is very important. Hidden phosphorus and potassium load is another under-recognized problem. Most clinicians, whether they check a protein supplement for phosphorus or potassium content, they won't be even able to see whether the phosphate content is abnormally high in that particular. The nutrition fact label in India or in other markets also, it is not mandatory to mention the phosphorus content separately. So you have to carefully look for the ingredient list in the label containing phosphoric acid, tricalcium phosphate, sodium phosphate, things like or phosphate additives. The word phos has to be watched carefully in the labels. Phosphate additives are absorbed more readily than naturally occurring phosphorus in the food. Especially in the CKD patients, diabetes, silent phosphate accumulation begins well before it starts showing up in the laboratory testing or biochemistry panels. Potassium is the second big concern. Products marketed as low sodium are mostly compensated with potassium chloride, so we should be very careful with the low salt labels. And real hyperkalemia risk is there in every patient of milder or moderate CKD, even are at risk because these patients are already taking ACE inhibitors or ARB therapies, and finerenone is becoming now more and more popular, being recommended in different guidelines. So we all know that the triad of CKD, RAS inhibition, and high potassium intake can be seriously detrimental to our patients. So don't let a supplement quietly complete that triangle, the triangle of RAS blockade, CKD, and high potassium intake. So you must check for the phosphates and potassium at the baseline, and then at least after 15 days, and then at 6 weeks. GI tolerability is a big issue with protein supplementation. Semaglutide delays gastric emptying, that is the way it works. So any protein bolus immediately after a meal is going to give extreme nausea and can even cause vomiting. Patient will stop taking the supplement, as well as maybe will blame the drug, or either reduce it, or may stop taking the semaglutide injections also. Then we lose the clinical benefits of both of them. So management is simple. Start at half of the serving which is in your mind for that patient. Then give a 2 to 4 week parallel slow up titration along with the semaglutide dose. Limit the volume of the protein supplement dose not beyond 100-150 ml at a time. Avoid taking it immediately after meals. Give a 60 to 90 minutes of gap. Then it is always better tolerated. Lactose intolerance is very prevalent in our population. Be careful of it. It may remain hidden in South Asian patients. And GI symptoms are often misattributed because of the lactose intolerance, and semaglutide gets the blame. Switching from whey concentrates to whey isolate frequently resolves the issue. On timing or the distribution of muscle protein synthesis, the evidence is clear that distributing protein excess across 2 to 3 intakes dramatically outperforms a single daily bolus dose of protein. Each intake should be delivering 25 to 30 grams of protein, which is leucine, which has to be leucine rich. As I told you, the mTOR C1 activation requires leucine at a particular threshold. Front load early in the day because nausea is minimum in the morning, even in GLP-1 receptor agonist higher doses also. So at least 1 or 2 protein intakes should be within 2 hours after resistance exercises session, which we have prescribed to our patients. I will also briefly flag the emerging calcium protein synergy data. Co-ingestion of protein with calcium activates the calcium sensing receptors and produces significant postprandial GLP-1 surge. Whey protein with dairy calcium may be offering a dual benefit in these patients. And its mechanistic argument for preferring dairy-based over isolated plant proteins where the clinical context allows us. Be careful and be in consultation with dietitian in your team. Now, This slide brings into consideration the three important, frequently overlooked considerations in clinical practice. First of them is heavy metals. This is a real and well documented problem. Independent testing by NGOs and other agencies has found concerning lead levels in several popular protein powders marketed in our country, particularly plant-based ones. In a patient with subclinical renal impairment, consuming a protein supplement containing lead over a period of months and years, well, you can imagine this can happen, and this will be highly detrimental. So we have to be very careful while prescribing the protein powders. They should be FSSAI certified, and we must be watchful about the lead levels. In India, the practical guidance is to prescribe only certified FSSAI preparations, but sometimes because of the lower costs, we tend to compromise with the quality, and that temptation should be discouraged. Now you have done the baseline panels, EGFR, ACR, potassium, phosphate, HbA1c, and then you forget to repeat them, or you just don't repeat them in time. So monitoring protocol must be adhered very meticulously in these patients, and this is the second thing which is frequently overlooked. We must be careful of the glycemic controls getting plateaued out or regressing because of the protein prescription, because as I told you, the hidden carbohydrates in our protein preparations, or the protein preparation which patients start taking by themselves without your prescription, are most of the time. The other important thing, we must not neglect the functional assessment, subjective strength, sometimes as simple as stair climbing, grip strength, and other meaningful day-to-day endpoints which indicate muscular functional capacity. Third important fact which is overlooked is the statins. This is the triple risk scenario that doesn't get enough attention in our clinical practice. Many of our semaglutide patients are having high intensity statins. Rosuvastatin 20 milligrams I consider quite high in Indian patients, but many of them are taking 40 milligrams even. So statin induced myopathy contributes to functional loss and functional sarcopenia, which adds to the real sarcopenia. Adding anabolic resistance of type 2 diabetes with inadequate protein intake, and then having a statin dose of high intensity statin makes life miserable for many of our patients. If a patient on this combination is reporting fatigue or weakness, so the first question is not whether I should increase the protein supplementation. We should review the entire prescription, the combinations, the adverse effects, and the protein supplement label itself. Consider switching to a lower intensity statin or a lower dose if the condition allows. But then cardiologist in your team and the patient himself must be explained what we are doing. So with this, I am with this final slide which carries the take home message for each one of us. Before prescribing, confirm renal safety with EGFR and ACR, microalbuminuria. Rule out frank CKD. Try to screen out the slightest or mildest forms of CKD. Screen for lactose intolerance. Review the statin, the preparation as well as the dose. Review the carbohydrate in the protein being prescribed. It should not be more than 5 grams. Look for the phosphates, phosphorus, the possibility of the hyperkalemia which can be induced with your preparation. Check for the RAS inhibition being taken by the patient and what are the current levels. Then whey isolate should be the first choice. Soy protein for vegetarians, or mild CKD patients, third party certified, FSSAI certified, well reputed companies as manufacturers should be preferred for choosing a protein preparation. Titrate slowly, start at a lower dose. The volume of the dose should not be more than 150 or 200 ml. Distribute across 2 to 3 doses, 2 to 3 intakes over the entire day. Aim for 25 to 30 grams of leucine rich protein per sitting. Front load in the day, more in the morning, that I mean. Anchor one intake at least within 2 hours after post exercise, and resistance exercises must be prescribed as we discussed in part 1 of this particular talk. The closing quote on this slide says at the bottom, the difference between a supplement that helps and one that harms lies almost entirely in the label, the dose, and the patient's renal and metabolic profile. So that is the entire message which I wanted to add to my previous talk, which was how to preserve the muscles and bone in patients taking GLP-1 receptor agonist therapies. Thank you, friends.